This video on understanding your bone density test is a part of the Better Bones Revolution Empowerment series that we developed for you here at the Center for Better Bones. Hi, I'm Dr. Susan Brown, medical anthropologist and nutritionist. I direct the Center for Better Bones. And I wonder, have you ever looked at your bone density test and thought, what the heck is this? What are they telling me? What does a T-score mean? And how do I know how my bone density is compared to other people my own age? How do I know if I've made any progress in my bone building program since I had my last bone density test? Is there anything I can say about the health of my spine from this bone density test? And you might even be one of those people whose doctor said, you have the bones of an 80-year-old, or maybe you had the bones of a 70-year-old. How can you tell if that's true? Well, knowledge has power, and today what I'm going to do is to share with you how to understand, how to interpret, how to use your bone density test. You're going to get lots of valuable information, so just sit back, relax, and learn how to understand your bone density test. Become empowered. Now, just as we begin, remember that this is a video. If you don't understand everything when we go through the first time, don't worry. You'll be able to listen to it over and over until you have captured all the information about understanding your bone density test. I'm glad you're with us. We're going to have a lot of fun. Let's begin. Today we're talking about how to understand your bone density test. So as we begin, let me say there's 6 ground rules. The first ground rule is obtain copies of your full bone density reports from your DEXA scans. That's dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. That's the official name for the report. DEXA scans should be several pages long and have many charts as well as X-ray pictures of the spine and hip. Actually, the pictures may vary and the charts may vary from one report to the other, but it definitely is a multi-page report. You want that copy of the report. Do not mistake the full DEXA report for a cover letter summary which comes with the report. What you see on the screen here is an example of a cover letter summary. There are sometimes errors in the transfer of data from the full DEXA report to the cover letter, so you always want to have the full DEXA report. I say ask for the report with pictures and all. The second ground rule is that small changes in bone mineral density are not significant. Often a person will say, gosh, the doctor said I'm losing bone, and when you look at it, they lost 1 or 2, 3%. You will note that Susan Ott, a very famous physician and researcher, has really reported and documented that you need at least a 5 or 6% change on a bone density test to be sure that the change was simply not due to how one was placed on the machine. So small changes are not significant. Number 3, bone density tests do not truly measure bone density. Now this is a surprising one, but important to keep in mind. The DEXA report calculates BMD using area, so it is not an accurate assessment of true bone density. Because it is an aerial measurement, those with smaller body size and or thinner, smaller bones will not get a true measure of the bone density. And actually, their bone density is often underrated in thin and small people. Number 4, bone density changes are related to life stage. The most clear example of this is during the menopausal transition. The average woman during this transition between the first 5 years before the last period to the first 5 years after the last period, the average woman loses 10% of her bone mass. Some women, however, lose 20% of their bone mass, and it's really important when you look at your bone density report to know what stage of life you're in. When you get to be 60, you should only be losing 0.5 to 1% a year. Many people get their bone density just before or early into menopause, and then 3 or 4 years later, the doctor says, oh, you've lost a lot of bone. Well, sometimes that is extremely natural because it's just the normal menopausal bone loss. So remember your phase of life when you interpret your bone density test. The 5th ground rule is not all bone density reports are going to look exactly the same. The doctors can actually decide on how they want the findings presented, so don't be surprised if your pictures and reports look slightly different from the ones I'm going to show you. Basically, all reports will have the same data, but arranged in different ways. The final ground rule is when you get a subsequent bone density test, when you're looking to compare changes over time, you really should have the test done on the same type of machine and hopefully in the same location and even with the same operator. While we think of this test as very precise, it's really not totally precise, and certainly changing machines and changing type of machines can make a very big difference and often make the comparison invalid. So let's get to work looking at the bone density report. Your report will look different depending on the manufacturer of the DEXA machine. So to start out with, you should know that there's two types of machine. One is called the Hologic machine, you see it here, and the other one is the GE Lunar. So if you had your first bone density test on a Hologic, be sure to have your second on a Hologic. And the similar thing with the Lunar. Two different types of major bone density systems for testing. Now, understanding your bone density test, we're going to start with the spinal bone density. These tests look at a few specific areas of bone, and one of them is the spine. And actually, this is a page from the spinal bone density sheet. You'll see it's got lots of information on, but let's hone into these topics one by one. This is actually the area of the spine they measure. You'll see it's L1, L2, L3, L4. These are the lumbar vertebral bodies 1 through 4, and they're sort of right in your lower back. So you will find every test reports these vertebral bodies individually and as a total of 1 through 4. And it's really the 1 through 4 we look at, not the individual bodies. You'll also notice that if you enlarge it again, like I say, there's L1 through 4. We want to focus on the total, not so much the individual bodies. In fact, Susan Ott says you should look at the total, not the individuals. You'll also see in the next part of this chart, they have BMD, and that's actually grams per cubic centimeter. That's actually the amount of bone density they've measured. You'll see in this case the bone density varies a little bit between L1 and 2 and L3, but again we stick with the total, which is the average of those 4 vertebral bodies for the bone mineral density. The next element you see on this chart is the T-score, and you'll notice this says young adult T-score. T-scores we're going to talk about in detail, but this is a statistical calculation they use to define the point at which they say a person has normal bone density, osteopenia, or osteoporosis. It's based on the T-score. We'll be going into that in some detail. This report in this same segment also talks about the Z-score. Now the Z-score is where you're actually compared to people your own age. And so the Z-score is often substantially different than the T-score. Another interesting part of this chart, and again we're talking about the page discussing the spine, has a graph. And you can see by this graph they place your score in a colored range indicating either normal, osteopenia, or osteoporosis. So you can kind of at a glance see where you fall on this particular test and on this particular measurement of the spine. The other major bone that's measured in bone density test is the hip bone. And in the hip they generally measure 4 different spots, but let's walk through this, the report, what's given in the report. You'll see here that the neck of the hip is one of the major sites reported. And people often get confused. They think they're talking about the neck related to the head, but this is really the part of the hip, that little narrow part where the hip ball attaches to the joint. You can see in this picture a little bit. It's that narrow neck of the hip where the leg bone joins the hip ball joint. And that is the neck of the hip. In the hip, they also measure the total hip. You see below the neck they mention total. And again, Susan Ott and many other researchers suggest you should probably use the total hip, not the neck. They actually measure 4 different parts of the hip, And the total is a nice representation of all of that, whereas the neck doesn't necessarily measure the total hip. What I often find is many doctors seem to report whatever is lowest. And I'm not sure that's the best way to do it. So we tend to look at the total. We pay attention to the neck, but we look at the total most of all. You'll notice also here in the slide reporting the hip results that they talk about BMC and BMD. BMC is bone mineral content. It's another way they're estimating the substance in the bone. And the BMD, which we're more familiar with, again, is the grams per cubic centimeter. You'll notice on the hip they also report the T-score, comparing your hip bone measurement at this time to that of a young person, a person perhaps 30 years of age. And you'll also notice they report the Z-score. How do you compare with people your own age? We'll get into what these statistics mean in just a minute, but you'll find both the T-score and Z-score on your spine and hip bone density measurements. Again, for the hip, the results are graphed. You'll see a colorful graph that indicates where you are. In this case, we see that the bone mineral density is highlighted on this color graph for the neck of the hip. Now let's take a minute to try to understand more about T-scores and Z-scores. T and Z-scores are statistical calculations using the concept of standard deviation. A standard deviation is simply a calculation to indicate the extent of deviation from the mean. For example, in this chart, what you see is 0 is the mean. The mean for the average population, say if you were taking people's age or people's bone density, this would be the average. Then you see you have one standard deviation higher, one standard lower, two standard deviations higher, two lower, and so on. In bone health, they have declared that osteopenia is when you're one standard deviation lower than the average young woman, when your T-score is minus one or more, and osteoporosis is when your T-score is minus 2.5 or more. Now what this means practically, if you look at this second chart, you'll see that 68% of the population falls within one standard deviation. So if you take a young population, 30 years old, for example, 68% of that population will have a bone density that is within one standard deviation of the average, either one standard deviation higher to one standard deviation lower. When you get out to two standard deviations, there's only 13.5% of the population on either side of that have more of a density higher than 1 standard deviation, or that have less than one standard deviation, between 1 and 2 standard deviations. When you get out to 3 standard deviations, if they tell you, oh, your T-score is -3, then you know there's very few people in this category. Only 2% of the population would have a standard deviation that's -3. Now remember, if it's a T-score, that means you're talking about young people, comparing you to young people. Later we'll look at what it means for Z-score. When you get out to 4 standard deviations, there's very few people that are 4 standard deviations out. And it's interesting, I looked it up. If you're -5 standard deviations, that's 1 in a million. It's very rare. Now the interesting thing about this, because it's a statistical calculation, 16% of even the 30-year-olds, when we use this statistical calculation, will have osteopenia. That means that they will fall within that category of being more than 1 standard deviation away from the mean. So it's kind of artificial in the sense that even healthy young women, 16% of them are going to be called to have osteopenia, and even 1% will be told they have osteoporosis, simply because this is a statistical calculation of standard deviation. Now there's a really curious thing about using T-scores. When we use the T-score, we appreciate that you cannot predict who's going to fracture by bone density. In fact, in some studies, up to 80% of those who fractures do not have a bone density in the osteoporosis range. In other words, their T-score is not -2.5 or worse. They may have a bone density of osteopenia and sometimes even normal bone density, and they still fracture. So you cannot tell who's going to fracture by their T-score. In fact, the vast majority of people who fracture have either osteopenia or normal bone density. Let's talk a little bit about T-score. T-score is your bone density compared to the average 30-year-old of the same sex. If you look here on this particular chart, you'll see the T-score is 0.2, 0.3, and the total is the total for the spine, this is L1 through L4, is 0.1. So that means this person practically has exactly the same bone density of the average young 30-year-old. A T-score that is anything less than -1 is very similar to that of the average young person. Now let's talk about Z-score. Z-score is when your bone density is compared to someone your own sex and age. For example, on this chart, you will see we're looking at the neck of the hip and the total hip, and you see the Z-scores are 0.5 and 0.8. That means that this individual has a bone density that's very similar to people their own age. Nothing unusual about that Z-score. If the Z-score were -2.5, you'd say, wow, this person has a much lower bone density than people their own age. And as a matter of fact, a Z-score of -2 is a signal for the physician to note that the bone loss is really excessive and that there should be extensive studies done to find the cause of the bone loss. So should you have a Z-score of -2 or more, definitely you need to pay attention. The bone loss is extraordinary. A really interesting thing about the bone mineral density test is, of course, to see what's happened to your bone mineral density over time. If you happen to go to the same facility to be tested, using the same machine, they will often present a comparative report showing you how your bone density changed over time. In this case, you see the individual was being studied for the spine, L1 to L4. And if you look at the bottom of the yellow box, you see these tests began when the individual was 46 in 2007. Then there was another test when she was 49, then when she was 50, 51, and 52. Interesting, because this is when most women go into menopause at the age of 50. So what we see, we have her age column, then the next column is bone mineral density. You see how the bone mineral density in 2007 was substantially higher than it was in 2014. When she was 46, she had much more bone density than she did when she was 52. Now, if you wonder, well, how much more did she have? Then you move over. We see the T-score column, which is interesting, but you move over then to the BMD change over to the right. And you see there's a change versus baseline. That means the change over all those years. And over all those years, the baseline was when she was 46. The most current reading was when she was 52, and she lost 10.3%. Now, if you go over to the fifth column, you'll see the change. It says BMD change. And the first column there is versus baseline. Now, in this case, remember, we're looking at the spine, and they're looking at the change from when the individual was 46 to when they were 52. Interesting, again, this is just around the time of the first few years before the last period, in most cases in the first few years after. If we look at the change from baseline, that is what the reading was in 2014 when they were 52, we see that was a 10.3% loss over those years from the ages of 46 to 52. Didn't I suggest the average menopausal bone loss is about 10.3%? If we go further to the right, we see that the BMD change is measured versus the previous test. In this case, when the person went from 51 to 52, there was really no change in bone mineral density. We can see in prior years there was quite a bit of change, particularly between 46 and 49. So this aspect of the bone mineral density test is really helpful if you happen to have it on your report, because you can look and see how much did I lose since my last test, and how much did I lose since they began doing the testing. And of course, this is an excellent way to judge the success of your bone building program. Now remember, the average woman loses, and the average man loses bone as they age. During menopause, it can be 10%. I say also sometimes even 20%, but you definitely want to bring the menopausal bone loss to a halt as quickly as you can. After that period of time, the average woman is losing 0.5 to 1% a year. So if you're 60 and you're losing more than 1% a year, you definitely want to take note. Many of my clients gain bone density in their 60s and even in their 70s and 80s, but the general tendency, if you do nothing, is to lose bone perhaps at 1 to 1.5% a year after the menopausal transition. Now, this again is just highlighting the change from baseline, so you can kind of hone in and see what's happened. This is another example of someone who had change from baseline, and this is another example of change from the last test. One of these pages you may have in your report, it will look like this over to the right. It's a side view of the spine, and you can notice that every single vertebral body is outlined there. This is called a vertebral deformity assessment, and the goal of this is to see, does the spine have some deformities? Are there some vertebral bodies that are crushed, that are a little bit of deformed in one way or another? This test is valuable because it can tell you if you have hidden spinal fractures. About 2/3 of all spinal fractures go unnoticed because they don't provide pain. It takes a significant amount of vertebral deformity or a significant amount of what we call fractures to actually bring about pain. This report will have to be analyzed by a radiologist, and they will look at every vertebral body and say, oh, L1 is fine, L2's got a little deformity of 10 degrees, whatever. So this is a nice report, but it takes a special x-ray view used on the DEXA machine, and it takes a special radiologist to read it. But if you can get this, it's very nice. The other thing you can learn from a bone density report, which we might not have thought about, is if you have scoliosis or curvature of the spine. You remember that picture of the spine that we saw on the early bone density slides of the spine? Well, this is kind of an enlargement of that. And the spine in a healthy state is straight up and down. When you see a spine that is curved, you notice there's some deformity, and usually it's a scoliosis going on. So that's sort of an additional thing you can learn when you look at the bone density test. You can also learn in this bone density test something about your fracture risk. A number of researchers put together what they call FRAX, which is a 10-year fracture risk assessment. And the FRAX uses 10 factors like age, and if you've fractured before, and if your mother has fractured, and if you use steroids, drugs, or have rheumatoid arthritis. They looked at 10 factors that are associated with fracture risk. And then they look at your bone density, and they put this together and try to tell you what the chance is, what is your risk of having a major osteoporotic fracture in the next 10 years. You'll see in this yellow chart here, they've assessed that if you never had a fracture before, if you have no prior fracture, your risk of a major osteoporotic fracture is 7.4%. Whereas if you've already had a fracture, say you fell and broke your wrist or your ankle, now your risk, they say, is 8.6%. Then they also calculate the risk of hip fracture. Hip fracture is the major and most costly osteoporotic fracture. In this person's case, it was very small. It was 0.5% over the next 10 years if they have had no previous fracture, and 0.9% if they've had another previous fracture. So you have to expect their bone mineral density and their other risk factors were quite low. It's interesting to know that this movement of creating a FACS, it's a nice idea, but they only use 10 factors. If you go to betterbones.com, you'll see we have a risk assessment that includes probably 30 factors, and these include things like vitamin D status, exercise patterns, even your tendency to be stressed and worry. So the FRAX is a good start, but really there's many more risk factors that should be included when calculating your risk of fracture. The summary thoughts about the bone mineral density test are, first, that these tests should be taken with a grain of salt. We often think the medical tests are infallible, but the truth is there's a lot of variation, a lot of room for error, so we should really take them with a grain of salt. Look for the big picture trends, not small changes. And remember that you need a 5 to 6% change for it to be significant. While we always like to see the bone density improve, we don't worry if there's a change of 2 or even 3% loss, because we know that they're not that precise. Imprecisions and possible errors abound. One of the nice books discussing this is Dr. Lanny Simpson, a chiropractor colleague of mine, who wrote a recent book, Bone Health Guide, and she actually made it her specialty to understand bone mineral density testing. And she lists much data about these tests and reports many, many cases where there's errors and problems. So if you're interested in that, you might check out Lanny's book. And you can find that on betterbones.com if you'd like. So remember that total load predicts fracture, not just bone density. While I'm really pleased to help you understand your bone density test, help you learn how to interpret it, empower you to understand how to use it, the real picture of who's going to fracture is related to the total load of risk factors. Like this little camel here, he's staggering under quite a few loads, but he's still managing. We want to keep our total load low enough so that our bones don't get exhausted and excessively weakened. If we look at the data, we see in one very big case study, hip fracture was 17 times greater amongst the 15% of women, the small percentage of women who had 5 or more major risk factors. And this was not counting bone density. This hip fracture risk was 17 times greater amongst these women with 5 risk factors or more than amongst the 40% of the women who had 2 or fewer risk factors. And if you have any question about your total load of factors that might be increasing your risk for fracture, just go to our website, betterbones.com, and fill out our very nice fracture risk assessment. You'll be able to see an array of risk factors, and you can judge your total load that way. Remember, looking at Z-score is helpful. It's helpful to compare your bone density to that of people your own age. Some aging bone loss is normal. I always expect to see a bone density at least similar to people your own age. When we get a bone density that's much lower than people your own age, like -2 standard deviations, you know that's an unusual bone loss, and you really should talk to your doctor about looking for the causes of bone loss. If you have any question about the medical tests that are used to uncover the hidden causes of bone loss, I've written a great deal on this. I actually have a video on this in the Empowerment series, and you can find all this information in the betterbones.com shop, and you can find our videos and DVDs there. But if your Z-score is -2 or more, you definitely need to look for the causes of bone loss. Also, when you think about it, probably at least half of the women are going to have a meaningful osteoporotic fracture during their lifetime. So I like to see a Z-score that's better than the average person. But again, Z-score is not the only important factor. So we look at the Z-score, we look at the T-score, and then make a composite picture. The real issue is total body strength and the body's capacity to heal. You can actually have a low bone density that heals itself very well, that's strong bone. And so don't worry obsessively if you have a low bone density. I don't like to see people continue to lose bone in an excessive rate, but a low bone density by itself does not have to be a significant problem as long as the bone can heal itself and there are not a multitude of other risk factors. Don't worry. We know that worry damages bone. All too often women use a bone density test as a reason to worry. Don't worry, but analyze your situation. Maybe listen to this video another time. Understand a bit about your bone density test. Then take heart and take action. One of the major actions, of course, is to begin a strong bone building program that involves exercise, that involves an alkaline diet, that involves all the key nutrients, and that also involves stress reduction and a reduction of worry and a building of resilience of the nervous system. The Better Bones program that we developed exactly does this. And so we're suggesting don't worry, take heart, and take action. You'll find information on the Better Bones program on our website, betterbones.com. It's been my pleasure sharing this information with you. For nearly 3 decades now, we've been committed to empowering women to take charge of their bone health. And it's my pleasure to help you understand your bone mineral density test. I wish you well, and we'll talk later.